Hello and welcome to the Career Instinct podcast with me, Matty Taylor. Join me as I learn how to navigate life and careers in the 21st century. In today's episode, we are talking with my guest, Arnav Kapur. Arnav tells us a bit about his immediate family history, his personal background, and studying economics at Cambridge. Arnav now works in international development and will take us through his career trajectory as well as his thoughts on how impact works or doesn't work in international development. If you like what you hear today and are keen for more, remember to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Castbox, or Podbean. You can also find us on YouTube under the Career Instinct. Okay, are you ready to jump into it?
I am.
Okay, cool. So obviously, I've known you since we've been at uni, and one thing that has always stood out for me personally is that you have always been a dedicated and hard worker. So I would like to ask where you think that trait comes from.
It's a tricky question. I'm not sure how much I can attribute much to myself here. I think that less so necessarily being hardworking, but certainly I've grown up with a sense of trying to make the most of the opportunities one has. And if I were to tie that to something, it probably would come from my grandfather, who grew up on the Pakistan side of what was then India. My grandfather had to kind of flee the country because they were Hindus in Pakistan, and there was a Hindu-Muslim conflict at that period. And he was, I think, all of 11, 12 years old and had to flee the country by himself because they could only afford one ticket, I think, to get him out of the country, and the rest of the family had to stay. But nonetheless, he's someone who has then had to grow up in a refugee camp and then was thankfully reunited with his family. In brief, essentially, his subsequent story of growing up and why I'm here today, why my father had the opportunities he had, was based on really my grandfather, being very driven and committed to making the most of the educational opportunities he had, which took him to a PhD in Canada and allowed him to really broaden his horizons beyond what he grew up with.
Can you tell us more about his story, having to flee from Pakistan to India, and then how did he end up doing a PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. So his family had enough to send one member of the family. He was the eldest son, and he had 6 sisters or so. And so he was then sent across to India in the first kind of groups of, I think they were UN chartered flights. He was there, and I think it was 6 months that he spent in that camp. And of course, in these days, with no contact or information with his family, and had to really support himself. And he found very small odd jobs in the refugee camp. His family, they were making their journey on foot across the border and down into India. And so then, I remember him retelling the story and tearing up as he mentioned that they were reunited in the camp, and then were able to establish a life in Chandigarh, which is a city not too far from the kind of northern region of Punjab in India. And so he then grew up there and was able to really excel at school, which continued, and he became a Commonwealth scholar, was from that able to go to Canada to study engineering and complete his PhD there.
So a Commonwealth scholar, just elaborate a bit on what that is for us.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So the British, after colonizing and of course stealing much of the wealth, decided to set up some schemes, so one of which was a Commonwealth scholarship, which provided education to, particularly in India, but also across in other colonies, an opportunity to study in other countries, other Commonwealth countries. So in this context, that was my grandfather from India going to study in Canada.
It just seems incredible, to be honest, that he was able to go from a refugee to being able to get that Commonwealth scholarship. And circling back to the initial question about hard work, you can imagine that he must have put in a lot of dedicated hours to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both from his experience, but also my father, who also similarly kind of had excelled in school, and it was really on the basis of his academic hard work that he was able to then succeed. Both of their stories are ones of hard work and diligence and making the most of the opportunities that arose that led them to where they are today. And so I mean, it's tricky to tie a very nice narrative around how it shaped me, but it certainly influenced the ways we've been raised to be my sister and I both kind of quite academically focused, perhaps excessively so. But I recall a close friend of mine at university. He had a very different upbringing. He's British. He grew up in the Lakes, and his parents are taking a very hands-off approach. But so it was interesting because we always had this very different experience growing up in terms of what led us to the university. And yet, I saw the appeal of his because he wondered why would often sit down with my parents at school at least to review my academic performance, why that was constantly a discussion. And it was, looking back on it, it was just the essence of our family had come to where we were today on the basis of academics, on the basis of working hard in education specifically. And that was a different backdrop to his. So it kind of just, did shape us differently.
Mm. As well as hard work, I guess there's also been a lot of hurdles that, I mean, everyone has to go through. But one story that stands out that is also about your grandfather that you have told me previously is to do with a briefcase.
Yeah, I need to get the details out to really remember it properly. That story in gist was the fact that he had, in the 1980s, the US began to reopen to Indians and immigration was starting to be allowed. And so under that, there was opportunities for certain Indians with certain qualifications to be able to apply to come to live in the US. And so this was something which was attractive to my grandfather and grandmother. They had applied and then required to go through all the documentation. The lengths of the information required were really extensive. So you needed to have real thorough qualifications and proof for all your academic records. This extended to even school records, where in India at the time, they weren't very well kept. So you had to do quite a lot of work to even obtain it. So he had to go through all of that. But when he went to Delhi, I think at the time, to try to submit these documents, was in the bus, and I think there was a protest, so he had to get out of the bus, but he'd left his briefcase accidentally in the bus.
And the briefcase with all the information in
exactly, which contained all the information that he'd collected, he went back and found it had disappeared. But thankfully they'd left, I think, his passport. But it meant that they had these plans to go to the US, which essentially just got extended by 2 years, which was the time it took for him over the next period to really get through all of these qualification papers and collect them again. So it was one where just suddenly he had this huge setback that threw his plans out of the window, and then had to spend a lot of time working through that. And I think at the same time, what also comes from him, from my grandfather, has been, so he, at the age of around 14, 15, his father died. And so it was himself, his mother, and then his six sisters. And as the eldest, and as the boy in what is and was certainly a very patriarchal society, he was the one that was then expected to take on that burden of raising is strong, but certainly supporting his family. So when it came to finishing his school and even university, he was constantly working on the side to be able to support them. And so when it was at university, when it was at professor positions, he made it a crucial part of his life to really focus on supporting his sisters. So it meant that actually every single one of them, which is very rare at the time, from him funding them and supporting them, was able to go to school. I think 3 or 4 of them subsequently went to university as well.
Wow.
And all of which was supported and funded from him. This was something he didn't see as kind of being kind or generous. It was just his duty, his way of supporting his family. And that was really inspiring, that he had for many years, over a long period, been saving, been scrimping to really be able to support them.
Mm. And I think it's really interesting seeing in different cultures what people's different duties are, for example. And it's really incredible to think that your grandfather supported so many people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny, we have these visions of impact and certainly a Western glorified image of it. And it's funny because I have a close friend of mine, a Chinese flatmate, Lan Fen, and she works for a bank. It is around a job around making money. When I describe why I'm doing what I'm doing, in these kind of grand ideals of impact, etc., they don't resonate with her. And yet at the same time, what she is saving her money for is to support her brother, who's like our age and suddenly has a young son and a daughter as well, right? And similarly, like her grandfather and grandmother recently got kicked out, and she's having to support them, and so you just
Of
suddenly
their
see a very different
house.
dynamic out of their house. So you see a very different dynamic where like we may believe and think of these grand ideals of impact and supporting others, but for Lan Fen and many others, it's just the reality of their lives, and they do it without expecting any medals or attribution of greatness.
For sure. You actually grew up in Canada, didn't you?
I did, yeah. So I was born there and grew up there till I was 11 in
Okay.
Toronto, and then we moved to the UK.
Okay, cool. So how do you think growing up in Canada has influenced or shaped who you are today?
Yeah, it's difficult to attribute all these things. I think an appreciation for the outdoors for sure. Canada is largely filled with trees and lakes, which is fantastic. I think a very open, friendly culture is also something which I took away and try to emulate in aspects as well.
Yeah. Can you give an example of a trip or time that you spent in the outdoors that has stayed with you?
Yeah, for sure. So I really enjoyed being in the outdoors. It's something which I grew up with my father taking me on many kind of trips, and canoe tripping, which is essentially going in these canoes but carrying your resources with you, was something I grew up with. And so when it came to kind of just the summer before university, I had the chance to go on a 52 days, so around 2 month long trip with this camp. So we had two leaders that had kind of organized and planned the route, but nonetheless, it was these two leaders and a group of 8 of us. It was really fantastic. We started in a small place called Yellowknife, and then over 2 months trekked through canoeing through lakes and rivers, but also having to cross land sections, which we called portages, up north and covering to Kugluktuk, which is in the Arctic Circle. That was a really grueling, tough experience. We actually didn't see any humans for that period, so it was very much relying on each other. So that was a beautiful, incredible experience, but certainly kind of feeling that reliance on the group, feeling the fact that you were cold, you were wet, you were exhausted from a really long day of paddling, but still had to get across this land section through the forest to be able to camp on the other side. You would just sometimes have to be like, okay, well, I've got to get through this and I've got to push on through. And that was a really, really valuable experience because it taught me a lot around how far you can push yourself. And we thought as a group, Eric, a close friend of mine, we kind of just always thought like, if we got through this, we can kind of get through anything. And that was a really formative experience because it gave me the confidence to then kind of approach university.
It's not really an example, but I definitely found that since taking up sport and especially trying to do, say, for example, something as basic as like a HIIT workout, I found that my ability to push through boring tasks in general or difficult tasks was made a lot easier when I was also doing difficult or high endurance sport at the same time, because it does give you that mentality of, if I can push through this hard workout, then I can push through anything. So I can only imagine on what scale you experience that doing a 52-day trek through the Arctic-esque region of Canada.
I think so, but I think you don't need to do that to get that experience. I think, as you say, building sport, building moments where you push yourself out of your comfort zone. I remember seeing a nice diagram of, we have stretch zones and then you have panic zones, which are the ones just beyond it. And it's important
Oh,
not to push yourself into the panic
yeah.
because you freak out, you don't get much from that experience. It's overwhelming, it's damaging to your confidence, but there is a stretch zone where you can really push yourself and learn from it. So yeah, finding those experiences for me, that was in that form, but for many others, there's many ways to do it. So
Yeah. Did you see a bear whilst you're on your trek?
we did. You really don't want to,
Yeah.
because over there, that north, they tend to be grizzly bears, which are pretty terrifying. So we did see one. Luckily, at this point, we were going down quite a large river, and it was up there was canyons next to us, and they were up at it was just one at the top. We had to watch if it was stalking us for a while, and after a while it seemed like it wasn't, and we kept paddling on the river. So yeah, it was we did see one. Didn't want to see it very much longer, but we did.
Well, there were no bears when you moved to the UK, I think. I might be wrong with my knowledge there. So you moved to the UK then at the age of 11?
Yep.
Okay. So how was that experience for you? Because that's quite young, so you would have just been going into senior school at that age, right?
Yeah, it was tough. I don't want to overblow it, but it was a challenge. 11, you're starting to form your friendships, and I had done that in Canada, but then you get plucked out and put into a new school. So that was a big change. And, I wasn't British. I certainly wasn't considered British. I was often labeled the Canadian, kind of Canadian Indian as such at
Really?
school.
How did
Yeah,
you
for
feel
sure.
about that?
It's not a label I would have chosen, but then you kind of, it didn't bother, after a while, it didn't bother me too much. I certainly did feel like an outsider. People knew each other, so I had to kind of, yeah, accept that and then try to integrate. So yeah, it was tough, but it also kind of taught me a lot about having to adapt and integrate to a new society, being able to kind of up and leave and drop possessions and things you have was helpful, and it, I think has meant that after university I've been able and comfortable with leaving places.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's definitely not a bad skill to have, but probably not one you'd be too keen to start learning as an 11-year-old, especially if you were made to feel like a bit of an outsider. I think being an 11-year-old at school is always tough, so we don't like the extra
Yeah.
challenges that have to come with it. Something you did put yourself out there for was applying to Cambridge. So was that a decision that was that something you'd always wanted to do, or how did that come about?
I'd wanted to do well at school. As well as my parents, that was certainly strongly shaping a lot of my choices. Then came to an opportunity to apply to universities, and I wanted to at least try my hand for applying for Cambridge. And I do remember my father. We were at one of his friends' places, and in Canada, actually in Toronto, and yeah, it was David Goldblum, and my father taking me up and showing me this photo of David at his graduation, and he was a Rhodes Scholar, so he'd gone to Oxford for I think a year is what they do. But anyway, I remember seeing that, and I remember being really impressed by that. Maybe also being impressed by the fact my dad was impressed by that. So then, kind of aspiring to hopefully one day go to a similar place.
And you applied to study economics. Was economics something you studied at school or something you've been interested in or
Yeah, I'd studied at school. I'd done okay in it actually. I hadn't really excelled in it, but I had been given books. I remember it was Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point. It was a very fascinating way to approach and look at social change. And that way of analysis intrigued me. And so from that, I read behavioral economics books, which touch on, again, social change, but a bit more from an incentive perspective and what are the ways shaping it. And then I thought, well, then economics at university seemed to make sense. So it kind of came from that I got quite fascinated, and international development became the area I kind of got interested in.
how?
How? Yeah, it's one I think shaped by a multitude of things. International development, the ideas of studying ways in which economics could be applied in lower income countries. I think that's a better word than developing, to hopefully help shift them to medium income countries and higher. So that was the topic I was interested in. Why was shaped by a few things. My parents had always had this notion of kind of the importance of contributing to others, shaped by I think also my grandfather's approach, and my father works in psychiatry, and so that was something which is outward facing. But even more so than that, actually, was my mother was a professor in her own right, and had chosen, when we moved from Canada to the UK, to give up her position and her kind of career to some extent for my father's post and for that move. And that was both for my
Okay.
father's professional development, but it was also this idea that his work and that contribution to society could mean a lot. And the sacrifices my mother made in that regard was something that I always found really inspiring. So that was something I took away from that. And also having had a chance to go to visit my grandmother and cousins in India, in Calcutta, where my mother's from, seeing just the degrees of poverty that were there was quite striking and confronting as a child. If you've grown up in Canada, the UK, you've seen a very different image of the world. And when you see young kids in those, as a young kid yourself, it's tough to deal with. So those experiences made me think, well, I could and should perhaps focus on trying to do something there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So then you chose to do economics at Cambridge, and obviously you had to go through the famous interview process. So can you tell us a bit more about what that process entailed for you?
It was an intimidating one. I think a lot is built about what they're going to be like, and you prep a lot, and of course a lot rides on it. But at the same time, in the end, I remember the first interview was with the director of economics at the college I applied to at St. Catherine's, and she was very welcoming. In the end, she was just asking nice questions about like why was I interested in this field of international development specifically, but also economics and general questions around that. But then the
Because,
second
sorry,
interview, yeah,
because I assume you would have written about international development in your personal statement that you would have submitted beforehand, right?
exactly. And I'd chosen St. Catherine's on the basis that Shreya is herself a professor in this field. And then the second interview was these two professors that were quite intimidating, and got some mathematical questions and
So
an
what kind of
interview. So
questions? Can you remember the questions?
I remember the riddle we were given was one where there was a monkey which had 3 coconuts, and the monkey wanted to find out which was the highest floor from which she could throw her coconut without it breaking. She had 3 coconuts, so of course she was limited, and she wanted to be able to keep the last one. So in essence, you had 2 dispensable coconuts. You had to think of, well, what was the best way of I think it was a 7-story building, of working out which was the highest floor from which she could do that.
Wow, okay, that's really interesting. Okay, the ultimate result was that you got into Cambridge to study economics. So tell us a bit what studying economics at Cambridge was like.
I didn't have very clear expectations of what to think. I didn't know much about economics either. So it was a course which remains, as economics generally is taught, very mathematical, particularly so at Cambridge. And I think as a result, quite narrow, which has a lot of downsides. I think I wanted and hoped for a much more broader sense of economics and broader course. And for example, we didn't speak on philosophy at all, or what the origins of money are, which are both quite foundational aspects of way you would analyze economics or economic decisions. Because if you haven't considered what is, let's say, a simple thing of like, how are you measuring what is good? When you are then looking at equations and solving them to like maximize utility, for example, if you haven't analyzed those first questions initially, then you're basing yourselves on assumptions you haven't necessarily worked out yourself. So I thought that was unfortunate it wasn't there in the course. At the same time, a course which has very little, I think, real world applicability. It's designed for a lot of academics by academics, but did impart a way of analysis, a way of considering, a way of logic that was very useful when it came to problem solving, even today, in a broader sense of it. So the specifics of it, not very useful, I'd say, in my experience. The broader form of thought was helpful.
Having spoken to a few of our economics friends at uni, the things that I tended to pick up on is basically to reiterate what you said, was it was quite mathematically focused. It was definitely good for the analysis, which I think is probably quite common across most Cambridge courses. But kind of they tend to be a bit old fashioned and maybe don't focus so much on the most kind of the latest theories. Do you think you made the most of your university experience? Do you have any regrets, things you would have done differently?
I had a great time, but for sure I have regrets. I engaged a lot with extracurricular activities, it brought me into a lot of different spaces, getting to meet lots of different people, which was fantastic. Looking back, I would do Cambridge quite differently. The first year I would do very differently. I, for example, certainly would not go out that much. I wasn't going out very often. And it originated out of a lot of just insecurity and feeling like everyone's going out and I should. And
So you mean insecurity around like fear of missing out, and because everyone was going out to say nightclubs, you thought that you should be doing this as well, for example?
yeah, exactly. And I mean, I want to be also fair that you come in young, insecure. So it's harsh for me to say, yeah, I should have recognized I don't need it. But yeah, you want to make friends, you want to be hanging out with people, you don't want to seem, lame. What I would now see, if people are going to consider you that way, then they're not necessarily the ones you want to engage with anyway. And there are ways to build friendships far beyond that, ways that are much better for your sleep and for
Your
your pocket
liver.
as well. So for your liver, yeah, not to mention your liver. So I don't want to, I mean, I don't want to suggest I went out a lot. I didn't, but I would still do even less. Instead, the academics and the resources you have there are just incredible. And I think we've both seen this now having left. We're like, wow, actually, we were being able to speak to and contact with some of the people that are leading thinkers, but not even leading people who've thought a lot more than we have about certain topics. And I think I could have and wish I would have used that opportunity a bit more to just reach out and have conversations with them, because I've since tried to do so and it's proved useful. I think the last thing would just be that appreciate it more.
Mm.
In third year, I really began to appreciate it, and I think we all did as we realized it was ending. But it's just a great time wherever you are to get to explore, get to think, get to have time is of a very different quality then than when you're employed.
I always remember the first talk we had when we first joined. One of the people who was kind of introducing us to the college said that time is like an elastic band. It feels like it's being stretched out and going very slowly, but then all of a sudden it like collapses and time just flies by and you're left thinking, my God, like where has this time gone? So I think it's great advice to make the most of what the resources are and also recognize the value of what they are, because it's for anyone at university, it is a once in a lifetime opportunity. You're only going to be 18 once, with the pure goal of just learning and trying to build as much knowledge as possible. So I think really try and embrace it.
I think so. And I think what I mean by what I say is like really reflecting during, taking points during, where you take a step back, you reflect, you look around, like both online and speaking to whatever the career service, etc. What are the resources? What are the people? What are the academics? And also, who are the people I want to be meeting and speaking to? Just taking that step back to then reshape how you approach things
Yeah.
could be a useful. I think I would have found that useful if I'd done it more.
So all in all, a good experience, would you say?
Yeah, very much so. Exceptionally happy and grateful for that opportunity. But of course, I think I could have done things better as well.
You graduated in 2017, which was 4 years ago. Kind of scary. So since then, you've gone on to begin your career. So I'd like to take a little bit of time now to talk about your career. What did you envisage your career looking like when you're at Cambridge?
So I definitely had a direction. I had an interest in the international development space. I had a skill set which was based in economics as well. So it was within that I was wanting to move into. Beyond that, in what form, in what organizations, in what trajectory, I had no clue at any point. But that was the rough idea, and that's kind of what I was looking for.
And something that you've brought up before, and I think people often think about you because you work in international development, is people assume that you're very altruistic and you're always thinking about others. Would you agree with that evaluation?
No, no, not at all. I don't believe in altruism. I don't believe it's a concept that holds much weight. I think we're all self-interested, and that self-interest may happen to have positive consequences for others. And so that's maybe where I hope more of my work goes into, but it's nonetheless equally as self-interested as as some of our friends that are working in banks and consultancies, etc. I don't see much of a distinction there. I would nonetheless hopefully say that it's better to be working where your work and your interests have positive consequences on others. I couldn't say it came out of any noble intentions.
So your career, although it kind of obviously started after uni, in your first year, summer holiday, so back in 2015, you did an internship in Bangladesh.
I did, yeah. I had read a few books on microfinance, which is this idea of having very small loans that are given to people in low income countries who are poor with the hope that they can build a business, be that a small vegetable shop, be that fruit, be that a small farm. And I got quite interested in that as a potential area of impact of changing and improving people's lives by hopefully empowering them to do it. So then in that vein, I had this internship that was actually very easy to apply to. It's at the Grameen Bank, which is founded by Mohammed Yunus. He won him and the organization won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think in 2006 or 7. You can actually just apply on their website, and I think everyone's granted, at least back then, an internship. So I went over to Dhaka in Bangladesh in summer of 2015 for a work experience there, and in a very light sense work experience, because it was a bit of following around some people and more an immersion into what does the work look like, what do these countries, what do people's lives there look like, which I'd say more of that shaped it than any of the work experience as such I did there.
Can you give an example though of just kind of what the work was you were doing apart from following people around? Like, were you helping these people who wanted to set up their own small shops or businesses?
So I think rightfully so, it was just following, because here I was a first year at university, not knowing anything, certainly not speaking Bengali, the language there. So I couldn't communicate anyway with most people. So we were just there to follow and to listen and observe, really. That was the intention of that experience, at least.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then the following year you had quite a different experience. So in 2016 summer, you did an internship in investment banking for Credit Suisse.
Precisely, yeah, it was quite the flip. And I hadn't actually had any interest in working for an investment bank, and maybe that comes out from the discussion we had just beforehand, but nonetheless actually more convinced by third year economists that we'd spoken to. In our first year, they just told us, hey, look, it's a good experience, there's no harm in applying. And so I'd done so. Out of it came an opportunity to do a summer of work. So I saw it as an opportunity to kind of get a sense of what investment banking and banks were about, because I think there's a lot of mystique around what they are, and I wanted to kind of demystify it for myself.
For sure. Let's just pause it for a second because I think one thing it's important for listeners to kind of probably hear, and listeners might have experienced this themselves, but often when you go to university, you are obviously there to study and learn as much as you can, but there's also for a lot of people that pressure on trying to find a job, a well-paying job, a job which you can learn a lot and delivers a lot. And I think a common theme for, well, our friendship group, at least at uni, was the pressure on kind of either going into banking, consultancy, or law. So a lot of us, I think, at the time were definitely considering banking. So maybe that builds up a bit more picture about why there was so much mystique around banking and why everyone thought it was this great career choice to go into. So I guess it's within that context that you were interested in finding out for yourself whether the hype was worth it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's really good to point out, and it's something which is really important to discuss, because I think this is something which plays a really heavy role in the ways in which young students, and impressionable as we are making choices around their kind of future. And yeah, it's depicted as these kind of aspirational, and not only aspirational, the greater issue is it's painted as the only way
Mm-hmm.
forward, right? And that is both because these banks, these consultants, these law firms are very successful at painting this image, but secondly because it is very hard to find the smaller fish, and if you don't make an active effort yourself, then all you see in front of you are the people that come running and screaming at you. So inevitably, I think it's easy to fall into this idea that actually the only real options there are, between those three, at least for economists. Yeah, that was definitely the backdrop of where we were making our decisions even.
Yeah. What is behind the mystique of working in investment banking?
A lot of boring, simple monkey work is my take on it. Of course, those who've done it for more years can speak better, but certainly in the first internship, in the year or two you spend in the kind of more junior positions, it is a lot of simple Excel, a lot of changing color fonts to match other fonts to match other color grading systems and making sure the shapes line up on a PowerPoint. You're doing that for hours, literally hours upon hours, and you're there until very late, and you're paid a very high wage. But if you look at per hour, you're not paid actually that significantly better than other jobs. It's just that you happen to work really long hours and you drop social life, much of actually the point of life anyway. I was not wooed by it very much.
What were the hours you were working?
Pretty long, pretty long. I mean, I'd get in around 9 and on average finish 1, midnight 1.
My
Some
goodness.
days would go a bit later, but yeah, it was pretty long. Yeah, I was living at the time with economists from Cambridge. Both of them worked in markets, which meant that they were at their desks from 7 to 5, and then the financial markets close and they're done. And I was working from 9 till 1. So we would not see each other for the entirety of the week, and then we would see each other on the weekends. But on Saturday, I would be sleeping for a lot of trying to catch up on sleep, and then go for a bike ride, and they would be out. So a very strange existence that many people live.
But didn't you also have to work on the weekend?
Occasionally,
Okay.
yes. Not every weekend, but
So, okay, so the way it's being portrayed basically is that you work really long hours doing basically font changing and Excel work. But did you build any skills? Like, were there any good takeaways that you had from this experience, apart from you don't want to go into this line of work?
that was very useful as a learning.
Yeah,
The second one being demystifying it, realizing it's not as sexy almost as it seems.
yeah.
And then thirdly, becoming really good at font changing and Excel work genuinely was, whilst pathetic, at the same time a real skill that actually, in terms of at least Excel work, has proved very handy.
And I remember we had a conversation actually back whilst you were doing your internship. We were talking about you were working with a colleague doing some Excel, and you'd taken the time out of your long working hours to teach yourself some Excel tricks, which at that point in time took you longer to get the task done. But in the long run, you'd learned tricks which sped up the tasks that you were doing, right? So short-term pain for long-term gain, essentially. And also you'd learned something, so that was good. You can now take that away with you wherever you work. But I remember you saying that the junior assistant that you were working with, for example, had questioned, why are you teaching yourself this skill? Like, just focus on getting the job done. And in a way, I think that is quite illuminating, where you must be under so much pressure just to get a job done that the value of getting the job done overrides you trying to learn and improve yourself as well, which is actually more detrimental in the long run because you're not building those skills that you might need.
Yeah,
To think
I
about.
think that's a nice one to bring up. There's a very basic, it's very simple programming called VBA, Visual Basic, within Excel, Visual Basic Applications, that you can essentially automate procedures. And it's super easy. I would definitely recommend everyone to learn it, because suddenly you'll become the most techie person often in a lot of places, despite it being very simple and accessible. I had just taught myself over YouTube over that summer. It was not initially appreciated because people were like, no, I just want to get this done. And also, in the context of working such long hours, being very tired, it's harder to find the time to want to invest in. But at the end of it, then I was able to build this tool, which, it was able to dramatically reduce very annoying and arduous kind of specific little Excel work from a few hours to kind of minutes. And then they kind of subsequently implemented it and had use for it. Yeah, there's that trade-off. And I think finding spaces and workspaces that give you space to grow, as you say, is very valuable.
Yeah. Definitely. And I don't think everything we talk about needs to have a takeaway, but I do think it is important to consider, like you say, your professional development as well as the job you have to do at hand. You might not make everyone happy in the moment, but ultimately the people around you aren't going to be around you forever. It is that trade-off and something to bear in mind. Okay, cool. Obviously, you didn't have a great experience. It wasn't for you. So you didn't end up going into investment banking after you graduated. Can you tell us the process of how you did get your first job after uni?
Looking back, it was a very random process. Whilst at Cambridge, I was a president for a society called the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism. The idea behind that society had originated in Manchester. There was a big push and a kind of student protest on rethinking economics, which was in this vein of how do we make it more relatable, more accessible, and more informed about the real world. There was a BBC World Service program on this kind of economic rebellion. And so I was then invited to speak on economics and what we were doing in Cambridge around that. And so I did so, and then nothing of it. And then when it was published, and 3 weeks later, I got this email saying, I run a UK aid organization in Kenya. We do interesting financial sector work. Would you like to come for an internship with us? And that's what brought me to Kenya to work for them.
Wow. Okay, so when did you start this internship? So you graduated in June 2017.
Spent the summer cycling across Europe, and then it was in September that I went over to Kenya.
And how long was your internship for?
So I was there from September till January. From that internship was offered a full-time role.
Okay. So what was it like being an expat in Kenya? What was that experience of moving to Kenya like?
It was the first time I was being an expat. Now, at the same time, moving from Canada to the UK, one could apply the term expat. We don't. There's a whole host of issues as to why we do in one case and not the other. But anyway, as to coming here, it was incredible. It was being thrown very much in the deep end. I didn't know anyone in Kenya. I came here very much with a hope to come here to learn, to see what life was like here. And fortunately, everyone speaks English. The language barrier isn't there. It turns out to be a very warm, welcoming country, and people are really fantastic. So as a result, it made it quite easy. For me, running and cycling are things that I'm very interested in. So that turned out to be ways I got to meet people and get to know others and find friends here as well.
What was difficult about the experience?
It all depends how you do it. So I came here not knowing anyone,
Mm-hmm.
which definitely made it very tough. I joined a running group, but otherwise I was quite lonely. I buried myself more into kind of work and self-development stuff. But underlying that, certainly looking back, I can see that I was quite lonely and quite isolated. So that was a tough part of it. And that depends on where you're going and who you know heavily. Because I think most of the expats that come here know one or two people, and then they get to meet their subsequent friends and activities, etc. Also accepting that it's not going to be easy. It's the nature of a big change.
Yeah. So you threw yourself into work. So tell us more what it was like working for this organization. I believe they're called the Financial Sector Deepening Africa, or FSDA. Tell us a bit more about that organization and what your role in that organization was.
It was really great as an organization. They leverage what is UK aid funds to trying to see how can we impact and help the ways in which financial systems work in Kenya, but also in the region. That takes different forms. That takes the form of capacity building, which is investing in, let's say, training for central bankers who can gain more experience on how to better manage, let's say, a financial crisis, or otherwise. It can also take the form of specific new innovative projects. So that's what I worked on. Actually, I worked in the fragile states team with Joe, who's a close friend of mine now, and he really was fantastic. He kind of took me on and really supported me in my development. I remember being thrown really in the deep end in the first week of the job, actually being sent to Rwanda and going to meet him there, working on a remittance project, which was really around how does one improve the ways in which financial flows can come and be reinvested in this case, in Rwanda. And actually it was specific to refugee remittances. How do we improve the flows that happen to refugees who don't necessarily have access to bank accounts or more formal financial services? So it was a mix of very different projects with a really fantastic supportive team that really made it exciting and engaging, and yeah, a great experience.
So you finished your internship at FSDA, but you didn't take the full-time job. So what happened?
At the same time, whilst being in Kenya, I had bumped into Yari, who ended up being my boss at a running event. He'd worked in microfinance, and Triple Jump, which is a company I subsequently worked for, worked in microfinance investments, trying to see if you could invest into microfinance institutions to try to expand their outreach and their work. So having had the experience at Grameen Bank, and it was a subject which was of interest to me for a long while, I was quite fascinated to kind of take that on and also get a bit more perhaps financial rigor, because it was then quite heavily on investments and analysis, which was something that I thought was going to be valuable to have. So then ended up deciding to join Triple Jump as opposed to pursuing FSDA.
Do you think that was a good move? Did you enjoy working at Triple Jump?
I certainly can say I had a great time at Triple Jump. It also gave me lots of really good opportunities to grow and learn, and brought me to places that I never really would have thought I would go. So yeah, it was a wonderful experience. It's now actually only been a week since I've left Triple Jump and finished that. So it's been fantastic for the kind of almost 3 years that it has been.
3 years is quite a long time to be working somewhere. I guess at the start you must have been really excited, and like you say, the job had loads of opportunities. So, what was going through your mind towards the end of your experience at Triple Jump?
Yeah, I think as you say, it's 3 years is a long time. It all depends on what frame, I guess. In 20 years, we might say that's tiny, but for now, and especially for then, I couldn't even see working for any organization longer than a year or two. The first year of which was really intense with learnings and new experiences, and then the second one was a bit more where there's kind of the adage of you need to spend 2 to 3 years in an organization, which I hated. I really hated that because I just didn't like it. I thought it was a strange idea that was important, or that employers would care to see it. But I did begin to see that actually it was after the 1.5 year mark that, having spent a lot of time, having built a lot of relationships, you had opportunities and also an understanding of how things work, and that enabled for you to take on new projects or new ideas or get to change things. So I became a part of a almost union-esque board of employees for Triple Jump, and that was a great experience. And then I'd say kind of the last year has been the COVID year, where things kind of stalled, where my learning also had began to kind of peter off, and I felt a lot less engaged with the work and was less kind of aligned with microfinance. I'm not sure it's as transformative as people hope or think it is. And so I was beginning to look elsewhere, and in the end, something did come around.
It seems that something that's important to you is the focus on continual learning and opportunities to grow. So, do you think that plays a role for helping you to make career decisions?
You spotted that well, because it's actually almost the core of what has driven my choices. Going back to the idea of a career, I don't really believe in the career notion in its kind of simplistic sense of charting along a very clear kind of ladder. For me, at least in my experience, and certainly in the field I've worked in, it is much more around dotting randomly on a page, but hopefully in some broad direction, which eventually I'll find out if it's right or not. So I really saw it initially. Leaving Cambridge was around the next 4 or 5 years were just about learning. And that's learning about work, that's learning about the workspace, that's learning about how I react to work, how I engage with people, learning around content, what are the areas that interest me, what are the kinds of things to do on a daily basis that I enjoy, and what do I enjoy to do outside of work. And so I just had that approach, and that was kind of the first theme. And then the second one is kind of around building something of substance, and hopefully doesn't actually mean building your own thing, but building, be it in your job, in your work, maybe an expertise, maybe a speciality of area you really like to engage with. And then that third phase might be really then growing it. But for now, and for this period I've been in, it's been around learning. And I guess the reason I've demurred from having a kind of clear sense of where I'll be in 5 years, for instance, has been, if you had asked me at the end of Cambridge where I'd be in 6 months' time, I wouldn't have told you Kenya. I wouldn't have even known about Kenya. Then it happened. Then if you were to ask me in Kenya about where I would have been in a year's time, again, I wouldn't have been able to tell you I'd be at a different organization. And so I've just seen retrospectively, I have had no predictive power very strongly around things. So I'm not going to be very prescriptive about my future.
Around your learning on international development and how to have impact, do you think you have learned a lot? Do you think the way you think about international development has changed over the past few years? And if so, how?
So I definitely have learned a lot. It's been a very humbling experience over the last 3 years living in Kenya. I think, particularly if you want to go into the space, I think living where you're hoping to work is very important, or where you're hoping to have any change. And in doing so, you recognize how much more complex, how difficult it is to do any of the things you aspire to. Similarly with what I've just charted out in terms of the kind of the learn, build, grow approach, with impact, I've also looked at it in that sense where I'm just here to learn around what works, what doesn't work, why things work, why hasn't the millions upon millions that have been spent in aid, why haven't they delivered in specific settings? Just learning around so many issues that interlink and play a big role in the end of impact. And then later on in my life, I can care about actually measuring any impact I might make. But for now, having a humility and an understanding that I'm not going to be changing the world ever. Who knows? But at least not now.
But your learning around impact then has, I think, in part led you to now move on to another opportunity. Can you take us through your thinking behind what your latest endeavor is and how it has arisen?
Happily, as I mentioned, I've just left Triple Jump, and in a week's time, I'll be starting a new job. And this is with a new organization called Kati Kati. And so this change in job has come about really because it seemed like we were not delivering in the work I did, but in many others as well, the impact we'd hoped. And that came about also just from a lot of conversation with Kenyans who are very disillusioned and see how actually they're not seeing the results that are promised. That took me on two threads. The first of which was looking at the ways in which expats and locals, in this case Kenyans, engage within organizations, and the fact that there isn't a very collaborative approach because of the fact that expats, we come with quite prepackaged solutions without a respect, I think, for the culture we're going into and an understanding of the place, and for a whole host of reasons. But anyway, that became something which has now taken the form of a podcast. And so that's been one side of things. And then the other has been, well, how do we close the gap that exists between expats or the people that design programs and the intended end beneficiaries? And how do we improve that communication to hopefully get more of the voice of the end beneficiary, but crucially accountability? Because the aid space takes arguably the most undemocratic approach to their work, where we have no accountability. We don't create spaces as much as we should for the voices that are being impacted by our projects. That is what Kati Kati, in brief, is hoping to do, working with two professors from Cambridge, actually, where one can, through SMS, embed it within an NGO or any organization for that matter that wants to listen to their end beneficiary and see them as clients and customers, to hear about them both before the program, to find out that they never wanted the well they're going to build, during it to hear that actually the money's being diverted elsewhere or should be given to this chief to run the area, and then lastly, has it worked? What needs to be improved? So
Can you talk to us a bit more about how this opportunity arose? Take us through your actions for how it went from this thought of thinking maybe microfinance isn't delivering the results that I want to ending up getting this opportunity with Kati Kati and starting your own podcast.
definitely, I think if it does sound at any point this was planned, then I've portrayed it incorrectly. This came about in a series of steps of learning along the way. The first thing to say is that I'd spent maybe a year having questions and being a bit more cynical around what I was doing, and then wanting to change, but not knowing what or how. And I spent that year avoiding that question, being annoyed by it, but then focusing elsewhere. And also had in my head this idea that I would just sit down, I would think really hard about it. I would read everything online and I would find the answer. in retrospect, it was just, what it meant is that I just deferred that because I just kept not wanting to do it. So then it was in August last year that I began to just start small. Started having a small conversation with, at this point, actually, it was Joe from FSDA around the fact that I was feeling this. What did he have any ideas on it? And we began discussing, and then from that, I had more conversations with people I'd met before, people in the impact investment space, people at previous organizations I worked with, and it kind of grew just randomly ad hoc, where I kind of began to see that actually this was something I was very interested in, that I had a bit more of a refined idea of what it was. And I had a lot of conversations. I was having almost one a day.
But something that just strikes me is just this incessant inquisitiveness, the drive to find something interesting and just want to talk to as many people you can.
Curious maybe to a fault. So it meant that I've kind of kept these conversations going in different forms with different people. But then it really came to be useful actually at this stage when I was actually looking to have deeper conversations. Anyway, to bring it back, I decided to come to the UK with a view of really continuing the conversations actually in person. I'd come to Kenya in 2017 with FSDA, and Mark was the CEO of that organization and still is. His wife, Fiona, I had met. She was a board member of an organization called Africa's Voices, which is a Cambridge partnership that today still runs as a company that this person called Sharath, this professor, had started it. I'd gone to the launch of this organization in 2017. I then decided to reach out to Fiona to ask her to put me in touch with Sharath, who was now back at the university in Cambridge. We sat down and just had a really good conversation on this topic. He was now creating with another professor, Kati. It was very, very early stage. It was the two of them, but they were beginning to think that there might need for someone full-time on it. And in the end turned into a job. So that's what I'll be starting in January.
Something that we've spoken about a bit before, it's how do you create these opportunities? How do people get the jobs they want? And particularly in the international development space, we have a few friends who, for example, have become consultants with the view that they will learn skills and then move out into international development roles. But you moved straight out to Kenya and were able to be out in the field, if you like, working there straight away and building up your own thoughts and having a closer impact straight away. So it can be very easy to follow society's path of, yes, you need to build these Excel skills, or yes, you need to get this experience first. When actually, I think what you demonstrate is that you don't necessarily need to do that.
Thanks, Matthew. That's kind of you to say. And if I could add one correction, actually, you said closer to the impact or closer to making impact. And I'd say, if anything, and that's maybe what's more important, is closer to an awareness of how you're not making impact. It's that ignorance that you begin to realize more when you're closer to what you think you are doing. That has been very valuable in my experience. And I think my experiences have been very fortunate. And I want to just acknowledge and accept the huge role that luck plays in all of this. But at the same time, there is another space there that exists, and you don't have to follow down the route that kind of is painted for you at university. And there's a great book, which you've read as well, called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas. He really lays out in his book the ways in which these consultancies, these banks, paint an image of how you need to obtain their skills to have real impact, of how you need to dedicate 2-3 years to gain the skills around how the world works, around how to do real deals, etc., before you can make change. And I think that it's really just not true. That those are important learnings. I don't want to deny that. But there are many other ways to do that. And if you want to be working in and contributing, let's say, to how things work in certain areas of Kenya, then you should come here and learn that first, because you have greater ignorance around that than you do around Excel skills or how to communicate and negotiate initially. So I think just recognizing that the set of skills that you need is a lot broader than the way that world works of consultancy, of banks, because those are useful skills very much in that space. It also has cross applicability in elsewhere, but to a lot lesser degree. And actually, let's say speaking Swahili over in Kenya has helped me immensely engage with people, communicate, and be able to much better learn and understand. That's not something I would have learned working for a big consultancy. And Everyone has their own balance of how much certainty they need and how
Yeah.
much uncertainty they desire. And so certainly for me, when I had the offer of joining Credit Suisse full time and then this internship in Kenya, the thing that swayed me much more than any notion of doing good was that I knew what my life would be like if I joined Credit Suisse working in London as an investment banker. I had very little idea around what it would look like if I were to move to Kenya and start work here. And that was an uncertainty which I found very appealing.
No, it's true. And it also brings us back to a point which we were touching on earlier, which was how you have got your jobs. And you haven't done it in the standard, you've applied for this job, you've got a job, and now you're going to have a career progression. A lot of the jobs that you've got, to use your own words, has been due to luck. For a lot of people, that would be too much uncertainty, especially with something so important as a job. Okay, to ask a few questions just to round off this interview, what would be your best tips for making the world a better place?
Oh, I don't think I have enough knowledge to really advise on that. But I think definitely a first thing might be look around you first. Wherever you are, whatever your topic of interest is, try to find small, meaningful steps in which you can contribute to that. And I think that operates rather than looking at the grand ideals of the highest level upon which it operates, focusing ground level at your local council, at your local neighborhood, the really meaningful changes you can start to make there, which will actually trickle up and more importantly give you a sense of what does change look like and how does one actually deliver on it. So I think that is also the first touch. And the second idea is maybe more around kind of humility and how does one do it, because I've struggled a lot around my impact. What will my impact be? And I used to kind of be obsessed around what's around maximizing that impact. We tend to be quite focused on numbers, would that be X number of lives or, days saved? It's just impossible, at least it has been for me, to really define that in any meaningful way. And at the same time, I want to have some form of a goal and an approach and a direction. And I had this quote that kind of I thought was really powerful, just by this Dr. Riemann in this book about death, actually. It's called The Five Invitations. But in this, she's quoted as saying, helping, fixing, and serving represent three different ways of seeing life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as whole. Fixing and helping may be the work of the ego, and service the work of the soul. And it really resonated with me because I'd kind of always seen it as my work being fixing and helping. And it was a reflection of my ego, of wanting to attribute success to myself, and service really being an approach around a direction that you try to do to match and align with your values is much more the work of the soul. And so I, let's say, measure and hope to measure my success more by how much I align by my values rather than necessarily any kind of clear targets. And I think then coming back to the question of making the world a better place, it's also around that are you approaching it in an approach and a belief and values that align with you and who you are, as opposed to are you having impact and are you getting to measure it.
No, I think that's a fabulous quote and a fabulous observation. And definitely, mindset is a very important thing that we all need to be aware of, especially when our ego gets involved. One of the seven deadly sins is pride, isn't it? So we've got to watch out for that one as well. And another question I'd be intrigued to ask is, has there been any pieces of criticism or advice that you've received throughout your life, your career, that's really stood out for you and changed your mindset?
If there's one I might recall, has certainly been my father gave me this book and called You're Not That Great. And it was a funny one to receive that from your father. It's certainly a hint of some kind. And in that book, this author really kind of does explain why you're just not that special and you're not that great. And it was a really useful learning because it kind of made me step back and go, okay, well, hang on. Maybe I have been, too egotistic. Maybe I need to be more humble about my work, about my role, about my approach. And it's a humility you then play into relationships and friendships. And that idea has definitely helped bring about, hopefully a better version of myself.
Yeah. And if I can give you the opportunity to round off this interview with some key points that you would like to summarize and get across to our listeners, what do you think those points would be?
First thing I would bring up was that don't listen to me. Like I don't know what I'm talking about.
That was a waste of time, everyone. You just lost your time.
Exactly. Or I mean, maybe more fairly, don't just listen to me. I mean, advice from anyone is subjective. It's based on their experiences and their biases. So listen to a lot of people, hear what they have to say, learn and listen. Touching on, I think, with things we discussed around seeing broader than today universities, it's painted as like, these big organizations, these big players, that there's so much more. And if you speak to your parents, friends, etc., you'll realize the breadth of different careers and experiences they've had. And so be comfortable with that, and that might come along in different forms, and that it's just a journey and a path, and who knows where it goes, but hopefully you can enjoy along the way and contribute positively to others as well.
Yeah, definitely. For sure. And I think one thing 2020 has taught us is your point earlier about this predictive power. You can predict and plan as much as you want, but really life gets in the way, and you just have to be resilient and adaptive. And however difficult it may be, and however impossible it might be, and actually often it's a privilege, take the most of opportunities that come your way.
Yeah, very nicely said.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Arnav, for being a guest on the Career Instinct podcast. It has been a delight talking to you this afternoon, because I'm in the UK and you're in Kenya. So
yeah, thank you, Matty. And as mentioned, if people are interested in international development space, then they can hear more on the Development Dilemma podcast.
To which we'll include the
link below.
Yeah, we'll include a link.
Awesome. Perfect.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Career Instinct podcast. If you're keen to hear more from us, then click subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest episodes and guests. To get in touch, you'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the handle The Career Instinct Podcast. Until next time, everybody.